Welcome to Reading Dewey's Logic, where over the next weeks and maybe years, depending on how long I can handle to do it, I'm going to go through Dewey's Logic. Why am I going to go through Dewey's Logic? Well, it's an important work that probably not too many people have read. It's a pretty difficult work, but it's a work that rewards careful consideration and careful study. It was one of the major works on logic, and it probably not a work that many people think of when they think about studying logic. It's kind of logic coming at it from a different perspective, more of a foundational perspective. And so yeah, I think it's an important work. It will allow, I think, you to clarify how you think about things, how you think about concepts, how you use concepts, how you understand science and stuff like that. So I'm going to go through it carefully, read through it, discuss certain points. And yeah, I should say I was inspired to do this by Gregory Sadler, who kind of went through Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit in a similar way to what I'm going to try to do. Dewey is not quite so hard to understand as Hegel, but he can be pretty hard to understand. But I've been studying his works for a long time now, or I don't know if it's a long time, but a fairly long time. So hopefully I'll be able to make it a little more understandable if you want to join me on this kind of odd trip through Dewey's Logic. So I'm going to probably talk each time for 20 to 30 minutes, read through some parts and talk about them. Today, we'll look a little bit at the preface. There's not too much that we need. I mean, there's maybe a few points to look at in the preface and maybe look at part of the introduction. So preface, Dewey basically notes that he's been working on logic for a long time. Logic, maybe I should say, was published in 1938, I believe. Anyway, he'd been, as he said, has been writing on this topic for almost 40 years, as you can see there in the first paragraph. And so his basic ideas, I think, are pretty consistent from that time, but he's always trying to improve how he talks about them, how he explains them. So let's see what else we want to mention. Yeah, continuum of inquiry. That's something that is going to be a theme throughout the book. He mentions his debt to Charles Sanders Peirce, who you'll see a lot. He does quote Peirce once in a while in the Logic, and mentions Peirce a number of times by name. And there's also some ideas that run throughout the Logic that are very Peircean. He doesn't always use the same, often does not use the same terms as Peirce uses, but the concepts are pretty similar, basically taken from Peirce. And there's a whole discussion about how accurately he, how much he is kind of how much he sticks to Peirce and how much he changes him for his own purposes. But yeah, so the principle of generalization with two forms, that's kind of a Peircean topic that is really important in the Logic, the two kinds of generalization. So we'll be hearing a lot about that. What else? Yeah, he says he does not mention pragmatism, does not use the word pragmatism in this particular work. Yeah, I don't believe it occurs. Maybe it does somewhere, but yeah, there was a lot of controversy about what was actually pragmatism, but we don't really need to pay too much attention to that. Yeah, this paragraph maybe we should focus on, because what you might know as logic is not necessarily what logic means for Dewey. When I was an undergraduate, I studied formal logic. I don't remember why. I think I just needed a credit or something, and that was just a convenient class to take. I enjoyed it, but so that's kind of what I assumed logic was formal logic, where you have little symbols and you're trying to relate them and connect them together and make things that are true and not true and so on, and transform symbols into other symbols. And Dewey writes, in the present state of logic, the absence of any attempt at symbolic formulation, so there's not really any symbols in the book. So it's all just words, basically. So the absence of any attempt at symbolic formulation will doubtless cause serious objection in the minds of many readers. This absence is not due to any aversion to such formulation. So he's not opposed to symbolization using those fancy formal logic symbols. He writes, on the contrary, I am convinced that acceptance of the general principles set forth in this book will enable a more complete and consistent set of symbolizations than now exist to be made. So he's trying to reform logic, I would say, put it on a firmer foundation, and then after that point, you can do fancy stuff with symbols. Right? So the absence of symbolization is due first to a point mentioned in the text, the need for the development of a general theory of language in which form and matter are not separated. So the form of language and what language is about, the structure of language, what it's about, are not seen as separate things, as they kind of are in formal logic, where you're just looking at the structure of things, how things relate. And you don't necessarily know what P means or what Q means and so on. And secondly, to the fact that an adequate set of symbols depends upon prior institution of valid ideas of the conceptions and relations that are symbolized. So we need some agreement on the concepts that we're using, the concepts and ideas, before we start symbolizing them. We need to agree on on how we're going to be using these concepts. Without fulfillment of this condition, formal symbolization will, as so often happens at present, merely perpetuate existing mistakes while strengthening them by seeming to give them scientific understanding. And that's kind of a way logic can be misused to strengthen bad ideas, making them appear scientific. Yeah, so readers, so you don't need to, so things are technical, right? There are some parts that are pretty technical. We'll try to break those down as needed. Yeah, this is an important sentence also, I think. He says, I suggest that such readers interpret what is said by calling to mind what they themselves do. So that's where you get like this pragmatic aspect, this practical aspect. How does logic come from and apply to life, what we do when we're living? So call to mind what they themselves do and the way they proceed in doing it when they are confronted with some question or difficulty which they attempt to cope with in an intellectual way. If they pursue this course, I think the general principles will be sufficiently intelligible so that they will not be unduly troubled by technical details. It is possible that the same advice is applicable in the case of those whose very familiarity with current logical literature constitutes an obstruction to understanding a position that is at odds with most current theory. So the theory that Dewey is going to present in his logic is at odds with current logical theory. So he's telling you, if things don't seem to make sense, go back to your experience. See how this applies to your experience. And he mentioned some of his debts. Yeah, Bentley is important. He later wrote a book with Arthur Bentley. That's kind of an extension of this in some ways. And of course, George Herbert Mead. Yeah, so mentioning just some other stuff. In conclusion, I want to say that the treatise that follows is introductory. It's a presentation of a point of view and method of approach. Although the statement of them has been maturing for over 40 years, I'm well aware that the presentation does not have and could not have the finish and completeness that are theoretically possible. So this is still kind of a work in progress, and Dewey continued to work on these ideas through the rest of his life. I think the last 15 years or so of his life. And he says, but I'm also convinced that the standpoint is so thoroughly sound that those who are willing to entertain it will in the coming years develop a theory of logic that is in thorough accord with all the best authenticated methods of attaining logic. Sorry, attaining knowledge. All the best authenticated methods of attaining knowledge. My best wishes, as well as my hopes, are with those who engage in the profoundly important work of bringing logical theory into accord with scientific practice, no matter how much their conclusions may differ in detail from those presented in this book. So that's another, you mentioned scientific practice there, and that's going to be another important theme throughout the book, is how this relates to the practice of science, of scientists. So this is basically a book, in a way, about problem solving. How do we solve problems? What do we do when things seem to not make sense, when there's some problem in getting the result that we want? And of course, this is the basic problem from which science springs, and Dewey wants to put logic on that kind of foundation too. Begin with our kind of everyday situation of, there's a problem, what do we do, and how can we make that method better? How can we make our methods of solving problems, any problems, life problems, scientific problems, how can we make those methods more effective? So I think I actually may just stop this video here, and I'll just make a new one, continuing on to the introduction. So I'll see if I can figure out how to stop the video. But yeah, then I'll do a new video about the introduction, going on to the introduction.